Germany lost 41 Junkers Ju-87 Stukas over Britain between August 12 and August 18, 1940, and 17 of those losses came on August 18 alone. That is the point where the Stuka stopped being a universal answer and became a conditional weapon. In Poland and France, it worked because the Luftwaffe had air superiority and the targets were exposed. Over southern England, the same aircraft hit radar stations and airfields, but its low-speed, weak defensive armament and predictable attack profile turned it into an easy target for Hurricanes and Spitfires. The public image stayed strong because the sirens and the dive looked decisive. The operational record said something else. Once Germany no longer owned the sky, the Ju-87 could still be accurate, but it could no longer survive the kind of airspace that mattered most. The Luftwaffe entered the Battle of Britain with 237 serviceable Messerschmitt Bf 110s and finished the campaign having lost 223. That is the cleanest summary of why the Zerstörer concept failed in daylight escort work. The Bf 110 had range, firepower, and endurance, and Germany wanted one aircraft that could escort bombers, kill fighters, and stay over the battlefield longer than the Messerschmitt Bf 109. In practice, escort missions forced it to fight at the wrong speed and in the wrong geometry. British single-engine fighters could turn inside it, separate it from the bombers, and break up the formation. The familiar criticism still holds up. Germany built a heavy fighter to protect bombers and ended up sending it into a mission where it needed protection itself. The aircraft later became a strong night fighter, but the job it was designed to prove had already failed in 1940. Germany tried to replace the Bf 110 and got a development disaster instead. The Messerschmitt Me 210A first flew in September 1939, but by April 1942, production had already been suspended because the aircraft was inherently unstable and pilots found it difficult to handle. This was not a minor tuning problem. The airframe kept oscillating. The handling stayed bad even after tail changes, and the Luftwaffe ended up with a program that burned time in the middle of a war it could not afford to slow down in. The numbers show how badly it went. Only 352 were completed before the program was effectively curtailed, and the Luftwaffe got very little combat value in return. The usual defense is that the Me 210 was just an ugly step on the way to the Me 410. That still makes it a failure because Germany needed a working aircraft in 1942 and received a stalled replacement program instead. The Messerschmitt Me 410A Hornisse fixed enough of the Me 210 problem to become useful, but it entered frontline service in March 1943 and ran into a war that had already changed. About 1,100 were built before production ended in September 1944, and heavily armed bomber-destroyer versions did hit United States Army Air Force's formations hard enough to earn respect. The problem was timing. Once long-range American escort fighters began showing up in large numbers, losses mounted fast, and by autumn 1944, Hornisse units were being re-equipped with single-engine fighters. That is why the Me 410 remains a frustrating aircraft to judge. It was not a joke, and it was not another Me 210. It was a usable heavy fighter delivered into an environment that was already killing the category. Germany finally got the twin-engine destroyer it wanted, then discovered the mission was disappearing under Allied fighter cover. Germany built nearly 1,200 Heinkel He 177 Greifs and still never got a workable strategic bomber answer. The He 177 first flew in November 1939, became the only German long-range strategic bomber to enter service in the war, and was withdrawn at the end of 1944 after years of failing to live up to the role. The reason it is remembered so badly is not mystery or propaganda. It is engineering and doctrine meeting in the worst possible way. 4 engines were paired into 2 coupled installations. Overheating became a career-long problem, and crews gave it the nickname Flaming Coffin because engine fires were so common. That nickname stayed because the aircraft never produced a record strong enough to erase it. Germany did not fail to build a heavy bomber on paper. It failed by putting a compromised heavy bomber into service, building it in quantity, and still not getting the strategic effect it needed. The Heinkel He 219A Uhu is the aircraft people point to when they say Germany had the right answer and then refuse to back it. The numbers make that claim sound strong at first, 11 HE-219s were built in 1943 and 195 in 1944, and the aircraft was advanced enough to become the first operational military aircraft with ejection seats, while also being the only piston-engined Luftwaffe night fighter that could meet the de Havilland Mosquito on equal terms. That is real capability. It is also the exact reason this program is remembered as a lost opportunity. Germany never built it in anything close to decisive volume, and production politics kept it trapped in argument instead of turning it into a standard solution. My view is simple. A machine that stays limited while the bombing campaign keeps growing is still a failed wartime program, even if the aircraft itself was dangerous. The Uhu won respect, but it never won scale. The Messerschmitt Me 163B Comet was fast enough to shock bomber crews and limited enough to score only 9 kills. That gap is the whole story. It was the first and only tailless rocket-powered interceptor to see operational service, and the German Air Force took delivery of 339 of them. Combat operations began in May 1944. The rocket engine gave the aircraft a spectacular climb rate, but the same system also crushed endurance. Fuel consumption was so high that the Komet had only a few minutes of powered flight, and the propellants were dangerous enough to kill pilots and ground crew in accidents before combat even started. This is why the aircraft still gets mocked in public discussion as a stunt weapon. The speed was real. The operational value was narrow. Germany built one of the most extreme interceptors of the war and got a point defense curiosity that never justified the effort behind it. The Arado Ar 234B Blitz flew its first combat mission over the Normandy beachhead on August 2, 1944, at a maximum speed of 735 kilometers per hour, and it still changed almost nothing. That is what late-war German innovation kept running into. The AR-234 was the world's first operational jet bomber and reconnaissance aircraft, and in pure performance terms, it was good enough to outrun most piston engine fighters sent after it. Smithsonian reporting on the type notes that only a few hundred AR-234B2s were produced, and only several dozen made it into combat. That shortfall mattered more than the speed. The aircraft proved Germany could field a jet reconnaissance and bombing platform before anyone else. It also proved that a technically successful aircraft can still fail strategically when it arrives in tiny numbers too late and inside a collapsing logistics system. The Blitz was real progress with no room to scale. Germany produced more than 1,400 Messerschmitt Me 262s, fewer than 300 saw combat, and only 107 had been delivered by August 1944. That is why the Me 262 war-winning myth does not hold up. The aircraft was real. It first flew under jet power on July 18, 1942, reached about 540 miles per hour, and was roughly 100 to 120 miles per hour faster than the North American P-51 Mustang. It also arrived with fragile engines, bombing damage across the transport network, fuel shortages, pilot shortages, and a command system that could not turn production into sustained combat power. United States bombers also destroyed hundreds of Me-262s on the ground. This remains one of Germany's most famous aircraft because the technical leap was undeniable. The failure sits at a different level. The Me-262 proved Germany could enter the jet age. It also proved that a state losing its war in the air, on the ground, and in industry cannot cash in that advantage. 10. Germany wanted 4,000 Heinkel He 162s a month. Less than 200 were actually delivered, and the Type's 2 claimed victories were both unconfirmed. That is not a comeback story. It is an emergency program measured against its own collapse. The He 162 first flew on December 6, 1944, just 69 days after design work began, and the aircraft was meant to be cheap, simple, wood-heavy, and suitable for rapid production by semi-skilled labor. In reality, the rushed design produced structural problems and poor flying characteristics. While fuel shortages restricted the little operational use the aircraft managed. A Royal Air Force Museum history of one surviving airframe records a total of 171 built, at least 116 officially delivered, and operations at Lech already constrained by fuel before the war ended. This episode was about failed German aircraft programs across every mission type. The The fighter story is even tighter and more brutal, so click into the next video and watch German failed fighter of World War II explained.